Let's welcome our speaker today, Dr. Fran Martin-Martinez. Fran is a senior lecturer in the Department of Chemistry here in King's, and he's going to talk today about how machine learning and AI in general is aiding in his day-to-day work, particularly working with the computational discovery and characterization of nature-derived sustainable materials. So let's start with the talk, Frank.
Thank you, Carla, and thank you, everyone. Let me quickly share my screen. Okay, there you go. Okay, thank you, everyone, and thank you, for the opportunity of giving this seminar for the King's Institute of Artificial Intelligence. Yes, as Carla mentioned, I'm gonna give a very high picture, broadly overview of what we are doing in computational modeling of nature-inspired and nature-derived materials. How do we design for more sustainable materials, and in particular, within the context of the institute and the activities that the institute is leading, how AI and machine learning is aiding this computational modeling and accelerating simulations and the discovery of new materials. So just before I start, I wanted to, of course, thank my research group, is really the people doing this research, and also my collaborators. So I moved to King's a bit more than a year ago, and I still have some of my students working in Swansea University, where I was before. So right now my group is in between Swansea and King's. Most of the work I will show you is obviously focused on computational approaches, but we do a lot of work with collaborators that work on the experimental space, because we have a very applied type of research, which is very focused on applications, and then we work a lot with experimental groups. So just to give you a bit of overall view of the motivation for our research and this very big picture of what we do in the group is, why do we care? What is our motivation? So, well, this kind of model, if I may, of Earth has one particular thing. There's a finite number. So we have a limited world with limited resources, and we have an increasing global population. That is, of course, creating many challenges concerning infrastructure, energy, agriculture, which are the main areas in which we focus. But we also create a lot of waste, and that waste is actually quite an opportunity rather than an issue if we know how to use it, if we know how to extract, for instance, carbon materials out of that waste. So most of the research we do is trying to link these two things. How can we valorize that waste to produce materials to address some of those challenges? Now, before I came to Swansea and King's, I was working mostly on my background in some nature-inspired materials. And the reality is that any material, any technology we could think of we want to develop has most likely been developed already by nature. So nature has done it in one way or another, and anything we could do is a very simplistic, bold approximation to what nature does. Not to blame us for that. Nature has been mastering that technology for millions of years. We've been probably a few or not even 100 of years developing our technology. So we are very much behind. So just to give you an idea of examples of that research, which connect to some of the work I've done before in the past, there are different things we could do or we could look at nature. So one example of properties could be strength. You see very strong and flexible materials in spider silk and in silk cocoon. So silk is a material that if you consider it by the thickness is actually stronger than steel, but it actually can be even expanded up to 60% of the initial length when stretching it. So, and it's made out of protein. This has fascinated people for many years in research. Another example could be camouflage. So how cephalopods, octopus, cuttlefish change color. They have a combination of structural and pigmentary color in their skin. And you could keep going across, looking around in nature, addition. If you think about how we develop adhesives, how we do any technological development of glue, we produce materials for which we need to clean the surface, we need to apply very carefully, while mussels adhere in situations when you have changing of temperatures, you have water, you have salts, you have many different more aggressive environment, and they adhere super strong. So if you want to develop a good adhesive, you need to first understand how mussels do it. Adaptability. This is a work we did on, and on this beauty here is a sandworm called Nereis virens. It has the ability to change the jaw from stiff to soft by changing the coordination of ions with the proteins in that jaw. So we did some modeling of that. I will show you a bit more in detail now what we did on this. And more recently, we are getting into some work on hydrophobicity and oleophobicity inspired by different organisms in nature. It could be plants, but it could be some insects, etc. So just to give you an idea, once after this overall view, for instance, in the case of a strand of spider silk, you could extract silk proteins out of silk, and then you can create models, computational models like the ones we do that I will explain later to understand how that silk interact with other materials. And in particular here, what we did is some conductive, flexible silk membranes by integrating a carbon material out of waste into that silk membranes silk membranes, the membranes were made with the protein you have in silk. In the case of camouflage, you see here, up here, how the changing or the feature of the skin of cuttlefish. In that case, we did modeling, understanding how pigments interact with proteins in that skin. And eventually, we worked together with experimental groups in Northeastern University that developed some sunlight sensors that you could put as patches in your skin. In the case of addition, we also modeled some of the main molecular components that are key for the addition properties of mussels, design some multi-layer material with that type of glue, and eventually do a synthesis of a material. In this case was graphene oxide with that polydopamine kind inspired by the addition of mussels, and characterize that material. And in the Nereis virens, you could see this the jaw I was mentioning. You could the protein itself, the structure was not known, so we did some simulations to understand how is the structure of that protein, and eventually worked with an experimental group. In this case, was from the Department of Defense in the US that synthesized this hydrogel that is able to expand or contract depending on the ions available in the media. This expansion contraction mimics the change of stiffness to softness that the Nereis virens has in the jaw. More recently now here in King's, we're working on looking at, again, how water interacts with surfaces like the ones in leaves, creating models for cellulose type materials or functionalized cellulose, and eventually try to synthesize some of these materials that are following the designs that we see in the simulations. Now, there is one bottom line, and after giving all this ready, there is a bottom line all here, and this is that we are designing for performance. And I think it's a key message I wanted to give across, because we will see that if we really want to mimic nature, design for performance is not enough. We need to go a bit beyond that, and I will explain a bit better that idea. So, so by looking at all this, and there's a lot of information in different projects, there is something which is together in all the cases. So if I reorder this, we have functional behavior of these materials. And this functional behavior, whether it's the cellulose material, whether it's the hydrogel, the graphene oxide with polydopamine, the patches, or the silk-based membranes, all this is observed and characterized at the macro scale. Now, with our models, we go very much down there to understand the fundamental principles behind that functional behavior. And this is happening mostly at the nanoscale, closer to the mesoscale, but still quite down here. How do we do that? We create some atomistic modeling that goes from very fundamental models of molecules and materials. So for those not familiar with atomistic modeling, I'm going to do it very briefly. And this is, I understand that in 3 minutes, all these fundamental ideas is like drinking water from a fire hose, but I'm going to start very fundamentally. So if I put this sphere here, we all start with models, right? If I put this sphere here, most people related to science might think it's carbon, because it's a sphere in gray. But not, I mean, it's just because we agree on that model. If it would be red, many people would be saying it's oxygen. So starting from this model, very simple model, we could build more complicated structures. We could create a structure of benzene, putting these sticks in between the spheres that we represent for a bond, even though there is not such a thing. What we have is electrons all around. How are those electrons around? Well, we could calculate the electron density. That's how the electron density would look like if we do some quantum mechanical calculations of these molecules. But it still doesn't need to say too much. So we could play even more. We could say, okay, how does this electron density, this surface down here interacts with a positive charge? And then color code those interactions. And then we do what we call the molecular electrostatic potential. So much more information, everything happening at this quantum method level, or DFT, which is density functional theory, a way of really solving the equations of electrons at that fundamental level. For those not familiar with it, is Schrödinger equation what we solve. It tells you how the electrons are in there. Now, the problem is that this is computationally very expensive. So we cannot really go to much larger than a few hundred of atoms with this type of calculations. Even nowadays, this is a big challenge for computers. So then we need to start doing approximations. And this is a story of computational chemistry and materials modeling, is what are the approximations we put in place to achieve a good representation of reality, which is accurate enough, but at the lower computational cost possible. And then we go to other methods like molecular dynamics. So in molecular dynamics, what we say, okay, fundamentally, we consider, we rule out the electrons. There are no electrons in the system, and we describe the molecule as classical spheres interacting with each other. The problem is that because we don't have the electrons there, because we want to reduce the number of particles interacting, then we need to describe how those spheres interact. And with that, we do that by implementing what we call interatomic potentials. These interatomic potentials are important because, as I will mention in a second, is one of the key areas in which machine learning is impacting. But basically, these interatomic potentials are functions that tells how every type of these classical atoms, these classical spheres, are interacting. But this still is limited. I mean, we could maybe simulate even thousands of atoms, hundreds of thousands. It would be good enough for proteins. But sometimes we want to go even beyond that. And then we have other type of approximations. One example would be coarse-grained models for coarse-grained molecular dynamics, where we simplify some groups of atoms that always interact as a whole. We simplify them as a big sphere, as a bead. There are other examples here that like dissipative dispersion dynamics. I mean, there are particle dynamics, sorry. But again, these are approaches to kind of coarse grain your system to be able to keep going up. Remember at the beginning, the macro scale is up here and we are down in the nanoscale. We want to keep building up in scales. Now, the other approach is looking from the macro scale. And there we have simulations like continuous systems, like finite elements, smooth particle hydrodynamics for fluids, things that are happening at the macro scale, more at the continuous level. The problem is that finite elements modeling is, let's say, or what happens here is not detailed enough for some processes happening down at the nanoscale. But what's happening here is kind of too many particles and too computationally expensive to go up in the scale of modeling. So altogether is what we call multi-scale modeling, as we go from nanoscale to macro scale. And then the challenge, or what we do here, is to being able to select what type of model, what type of simplification we want to go with, depending on the scale at which we want to understand the process. However, you've noticed probably there is something here. There is a gap there. And it's the mesoscale. The mesoscale is too large, usually for atomistic modeling, but is too detailed for continuous modeling. And this is one of the fundamental challenges in multi-scale modeling in general, and different approaches are continuously put in place to address this. So basically, the challenge is we are in between this functional behavior at the macro scale and this fundamental understanding at the nanoscale. And this is, in my opinion, one of the main challenges in which machine learning and artificial intelligence is helping nowadays in multi-scale modeling and in computational chemistry, which is how to bridge these two apparently separated scales and behaviors. This could be done through different ways, and I'm going to mention only some of them in which we are especially interested and especially active. One is property prediction at the very small scales. So as I mentioned, quantum methods, or DFTs, are computationally very expensive. That means that you have so many atoms interacting and with so many electrons that it takes computing time to calculate those structures. So what's happening now is if you are able to put the investment and the time to calculate those properties for large data sets of molecules, and if that data is accurate and of good quality, you have then a decent amount of data to train different machine learning models for doing property prediction of those electronic properties without the need of recalculating that with quantum mechanical methods. So the big challenge here, though, is the quality of data. So another message I would like to give across here is good data makes good models. You could have a lot of data, and you could train a model, and the model will make predictions. But if that data was not good, the model predictions will be crap. We always call it artificial intelligence. It's artificial for sure, but it's not that intelligent. So if the data is not good, the predictions are not good. And this is something to keep always in mind, not because you get outputs, those outputs are, and that applies to any other tools you're working with, but in this case is chemical data. The other point was what I was mentioning about the interatomic potential. So is a faster and more accurate way to simulate systems when you go up into the molecular dynamics space. Basically are interatomic potentials that in some cases have an accuracy closer than to DFT or to quantum mechanical methods, but still affordable for larger systems. This is a very, very active field nowadays. As it happened with the interatomic potentials before machine learning, one of the challenges here is how accurate they are when it comes, or when you are trying to simulate materials with functional groups or with atoms that are not described in the default interatomic potential, because the interatomic potentials in general, whether they are classical or machine learning, they are developed ad hoc for some specific type of atoms. So you don't have it for the entire periodic table. You need to implement that and develop an interatomic potential for the specific atoms you're interested in. And then the other part goes up into the macroscopic level, which is materials discovery. So if you have experimental data, the same as in property prediction, if you're training your models with available experimental data, you might make predictions and discover it up at the level of the material, at the macroscopic level, without the need of doing all these simulations. But again, you need a lot of data, which when it comes to experiments is not very abundant. So in the experimental data, I'd say that rather than a challenge with the quality of the data, the challenge is in the availability of enough data for the models to learn appropriately, because the models learn on data. The more data you have, if it's good, the better they will learn. Okay, so there is, with that in mind, there is still something missing. And I just changed the picture to zoom in these three here on the right-hand side. So we were thinking, and I said to keep in mind the design for performance when we were talking about bio-inspired materials. But there is something missing. So if you look at this bottom right corner, what I show here is a super advanced energy harvesting device that, rather than the photovoltaics technologies that we have, nature has mastered for millions of years. So these three: harvest energy, transform energy from the sun into chemical energy, uses that also to develop wood, which is super strong, and is an amazing technological factory. Unlike our technologies, it has something also which is very advanced, and it is that the same way it provides all these properties, it's able to reintegrate back into the material cycle. So that there is no waste out of this after the end of life. Of course, it's impossible for us to mimic that, because if there is no waste out of this, it's because it's integrated in an ecosystem with bacteria, with fungi, with 1,000 things that we are not going to put in place for our photovoltaic panels, but we can still learn messages. And the messages are that we need to start thinking, when we create materials, not only on designing for performance, but designing for circularity as well as performance. And this is something that we need to keep in mind when we implement any sort of a strategy for materials design and discovery. So this is basically what, in the context in which we are working in my group. And because we need to start somewhere, we started looking at, okay, if biomass is producing a lot of waste per year, why don't we start looking at valorizing this biomass and see what materials we could create out of that biomass? And this basically what we do is, how can we mine materials? How can we mine carbon out of waste? And then think of how to create materials that eventually could also be recycled back into the material cycle. So this goes into the concept of biorefinery. So basically, you could work with biomass waste, and within biorefinery, you could separate the different components. If it's coming from lignocellulosic biomass, you would produce lignin and polysaccharides like cellulose and hemicellulose. Depending on the source of biomass, you could obtain proteins, you could obtain lipids, all different types of individual components that are coming out of the biomass waste. I'm here just showing some of them, but ideally it could be any sort of biomass or carbon-based waste. Some of them, like shrimp shells or mycelium, are rich in chitin. Others, like sewage, have proteins and many other things. Algae are very rich in lipids. So, but in any cases, there are sources to produce these initial materials. In the biorefinery concept, you could have also other more advanced materials. You could produce different types of bio-based polymers out of these initial building blocks. You could also work on pyrolysis and hydrothermal processing of biomass to produce bio-oils. This is one of the things we are looking at on biochars. And at the end of the day, you have a family of building blocks. So in the group, we are focused on mostly how to simulate these building blocks and how to integrate that into something useful. We are working on cellulose modeling, lignin depolymerization. We are working on some polymers like polyhydroxyalkanoates. These are bio-based polymers that could be also degraded back into individual building blocks. We work on some work on proteins. That case is more related to the cephalopods color changing, but still some modeling on that. These are things we could do with our techniques. And then we are mostly focused also on biochar and bio-oils, that they could be used, the biochars for energy storage or electrodes for energy storage or for soil remediation, while the bio-oils are used for asphalt. Anyway, this is a family of building blocks. Many of them we could identify, and for us, the key idea is how do we integrate that and assemble that into useful materials. One example is the one I gave before, where we were using proteins coming off silk cocoons, combine them with carbon biochar coming from chitin, in that case, from shrimp shells, and assemble that into useful membranes that are conductive and are resistant. But then again, the idea was, okay, we can create materials by assembly of some of these building blocks, but how do they degrade back? I mean, understanding how to break them down, how do they react, and how can we recover some of the individual building blocks? And this is what we do then for looking for applications. Mostly in our group, we focus on agriculture, energy, and infrastructure. So as I said, biochars, for instance, for soil remediation, self-healing infrastructure, self-healing asphalt with bio-oils, and electrodes for energy. Just again, as I said, how is this multi-scale modeling I was talking about fitting in here? Well, I mean, when you are in individual smaller building blocks, you could apply those DFT methods. As you go into assembly, and this assembly, you should be looking at molecular dynamics and maybe hopefully use these coarse grain models to go up in the scale. Now, still the challenge is the mesoscale, and then is where, as I said, machine learning is coming into place to assist with regression models for property prediction, interatomic potential, or eventually discover those materials. Now, all this framework has, however, some challenges associated. And one of the challenges is that so much computing and so much data centers and supercomputing facilities is actually increasing also the energy needs. So it's important also to learn, okay, this is very good, but we also need to do it in the most efficient way possible. Not to mention that we give for granted access to supercomputing in the case of modeling, but this is not that obvious. So there are many parts of the world where they don't have access to supercomputing. Here you could say account from 1 to 150 or the top 500 supercomputing facilities in the world. Now, if we make more efficient computing, more efficient methods and algorithms, we might be decreasing the energy consumption of those centers because we make more efficient use of resources. And we will be also democratizing the use of that computing by enabling using or training those models maybe in laptops and in devices that do not require lots of CPUs and GPUs. So there is a need for greener computing and also accessing resource-constrained areas of the world. So think of or move by that idea, and this is the main or last part of the talk in which I'm going to give you some details, is why we started looking at more efficient ways to codify the structure of molecules and train machine learning models. And that is taking one step back, and is how do we talk chemistry to computers? So probably, I mean, some of you might be familiar with it if you work in this space. Some of the people might not be that much, but basically there are different ways to codify the structure of molecules into something a computer could read. I'm going to give you only one example, although there are many others, but one of them is what we call SMILES representation. So SMILES representation is a way that you go and if you have the structure of a molecule like here, you codify that structure into a string of characters. So you could see here oxygen equal M plus in brackets, which represent this oxygen, this nitrogen positive here. And then you have another series of characters that describe what this molecule is. These, before going into the computer, is then codified in what we call one-hot encoding. Basically, if this is the characters you have in the smiles, here in the other axis, you have the characters that you have available in your entire data set of molecules. This is not the, I mean, it could be the entire periodic table and types of bonds, but you restrained this to the available in the data set to keep it smaller. Because now what you do is you assign a 1 if that character appears in the molecule and 0 if not. And you have this matrix of 1 and 0s, which is what we call one-hot encoding. So we had this way of, or we developed a work, and this done by Emilio Núñez Andrade in the group, that basically the idea was, can we reduce the size of these one-hot encodings by doing some sort of embedding of it? And that embedding, without going into technical details, could be a linear reduction or a power of 2 reduction or any other power you would like. And in this case, we're doing by a number of a reduction of 8. When you do that, which might not seem that important in a small molecule, it is important in bigger molecules like these ones that are used in organic photovoltaics. So a smile looks like that, and a one-hot encoding is like that. So if you check actually small molecule versus a big molecule, I mean, the reduction you have when you have a huge one-hot encoding is significant. Now, more importantly, when we did this for large data sets, and we did it for 3 different data sets, Sing, GDB13, TM9, these are available in online. For 2 different models, a variational autoencoder and a recurrent neural network, for different ways of reproducing the molecules, like smiles, deep smiles, and selfie. And once we did all this, we test the computational resources we were using. Memory, disk usage, this memory reduce efficiency in the disk and time. So we monitor these parameters, these metrics for the use of resources. And we also monitor some parameters like molecular validity, diversity, and reconstruction rates of the molecules generated by these 2 models, the variational autoencoder and the recurrent neural network. Of course, when you look at all these 3 different data sets, 2 models, 3 molecular representations, the amount of data was very large. The amount of data to analyze as well was very large. So just to highlight one of the results, this is for the variational autoencoder with the smiles, and I'm showing here the memory usage, the disk usage, and the validity as you increase down here the number of molecules in the data set you use for the training. What you could see here is that as you increase the number of molecules in the data set you use for training this variational autoencoder, the one-hot encoding increases the memory needs exponentially, keeps a disk usage that linearly goes up, and has a validity of molecule that, well, is in a plateau. When you use our encodings, you use less memory, you almost use very little disk space, and you keep the same sort of performance in the validity of molecules produced. So the message is 50% less RAM memory, 80% less disk usage, but same molecular validity or same performance of the variational autoencoder. The results were not that impressive with the recurrent neural network, by the way, because of the reason that is a deep neural network. You have many layers, and our embedding is mostly affecting the first layer. So in a variational autoencoder is affecting the encoder. In the recurrent neural network, that effect it also exists, but it gets diluted as you increase the number of layers in your network. We apply this also for, excuse me. We apply this also for the embedded Morgan fingerprints. So Morgan fingerprints is another way to codify, similar to the one-hot encoding. Rather than a matrix, here is a vector. basically is a vector that assigns a bit. So it calculates all the different substructure within a molecule and assigns assigns a bit where that substructure exists and is empty if for those that do not exist. So basically, every bit in this vector represents the substructures in the molecule. The combination of all of them would give you the complete molecule. So this is a standard also used in machine learning for training models. We also did, in this case, other types of data sets, the QM9, a non-Fullerene acceptor, a RedDB database, and we tested now 5 different types of models. Random forest, multi-layer perceptron, k-neighbors regressor, gradient booster regression, and deep neural network. So this everything we were testing, we did some hyperparameters optimization, and without, of course, showing all the different graphs we got out of it, let me just show one of them, because in this case, we use it to predict the homolumo of some molecules after the training. Here, what you see is the distribution of energy gap, the difference in energy between the HOMO and the LUMO, for all the molecules across a data set. So the top one is the Morgan fingerprint. The other two, the green and the pink, are our embeddings for 2 different compressions, so 8 reduction or 16 reduction. So in some cases, like the random forest or in the gradient booster regressor, our embedding doesn't really improve. So meaning like the fitting is more or less the same. We were getting, if you compare the predictions of the energy gap versus the real, I see there is this a typo here in the image, but the black line, which is seen somewhere, or gray line, is the experimental values. So, and then this percentage is how accurate it's getting to the experimental values. But what I wanted to point out is in cases like the MLP, the multi-layer perception of the deep neural network, while Morgan fingerprint of the standard method was giving an 88% of accuracy or representation of the experimental gap values, our approaches were increasing that over 95%. So you are not only reducing memory and speeding up, you're also doing a property prediction, which is more accurate. This is actually was surprising to us, because our expectation is the moment you compress and condense the information, we would expect maybe you would use less resources, but we thought it would penalize the learning and the predictions. But that's not the case. So the surprise bit that is fundamentally empirical is that you could still go down the avenue of do not have super expanded molecular representations like the one-hot encoding or very long Morgan fingerprints, but you could condense those, you could embed those into smaller, denser molecular representations and still not even achieve the same performance, which is what happened, for instance, in random forest or in gradient booster regressor, but you could, in fact, even improve as it happened in the MLP or the deep neural network. So the previous one in one-hot encoding was already published, and this is right now under revision, although we have a Chem archive available for this. So hopefully it will be out soon. Now, the last part is, okay, now we use these methods not only on property prediction, but also on molecular discovery. What we found, again, and now moving away or assuming we are using the embedding and that we are using less computational resources, we also found that even though the predictions were not that bad, they could still be improved. And this is another study we did on the donor acceptor HOMO and LUMO values for a database we built on organic photovoltaics. So what you see here is predictive energy in the y-axis and the real energy in the x. So ideally, we would like this to be aligned across the diagonal if we are having very good predictions. The problem is that our database in this case, because it was specific to organic photovoltaics, not like before in which we were using more general available organic molecules databases, in this case was very limited. So we have only a few, like 800 molecules. So then the properties are not good. So what is what we did? We did what we call transfer learning, is you train the model with one of those big organic molecule databases. So your model, let's say, learns organic molecule, organic chemistry with molecules of any kind. And then we fine-tune the model, which is the transfer learning, to the specific organic photovoltaics molecules we're interested in. So if you just train with organic photovoltaics molecules from our database, these are the results. If you do the transfer learning, so if you train with general data sets and then you transfer, you see that the values for HOMO and LUMO gaps really align across the diagonal. So there is much more coincidental agreement between the predicted energies and the real energies. So this is quite a massive improvement as you do a transfer learning in the prediction of HOMO-LUMO energies for organic photovoltaics materials. The other part we did, just to summarize in a couple of graphs, is molecular discovery. So basically, we ask a model to suggest new molecules based on those it has learned from our database. So what you see here is, in this case, is the synthetic accessibility score. And in blue is the acceptors in our database when we train it, and in green those that the model has generated, like new molecules. Of course, I mean, there is not a perfect agreement, but it's not that off. Here we need to figure out what's going on here. When you look at the donors, that is predicting more or less well around here, but is generating molecules with a synthetic accessibility score in a range of 4 that the actual real database we use for the training do not have. So there's still improvement here. When it comes to the HOMO-LUMO gap, is a bit better, but still there are some disagreements. But what we want to see, at least if we are trying to keep the shape, basically whether we are generating acceptors or donors, how it aligns to the data it was used for training. Anyways, just to give an idea of what are the steps we are taking in predicting properties. As I said, the beauty of it is there is no DFT, there is no quantum methods used for this. This is based on model learning and model predictions, and goes back to the beginning of the talk where I was saying where are some of the areas in which we are impacting with the use of machine learning. Just to finalize, what is next? Well, there are so many things. I don't know how you feel about it, but there are so many things going on nowadays on the use of machine learning and AI that I'm starting to be scared of opening my browser and trying to search for the literature. It's impossible to keep pace with everything that is being published. And more dangerously, it's impossible to understand or know well what is good data, good models, and good predictions versus something that maybe is not. And then that's imposing. I mean, it's great we are having these techniques, but it's also a challenge to keep an eye on when it comes to continuing the research into new materials and molecules. Just to pick a couple of ideas from other people working on this. So one of the things people is suggesting is a work from Marcus Wheeler at MIT, is to move on into multi-agent modeling. So basically is you have different agents, and by agent, we all know about the style of ChatGPT or this sort of stuff, but basically our agents are designed and trained on specific data for specific tasks. And then you have different agents that talk to each other to really keep advancing in the molecular discovery. So you have here these the human, which has a chat with these AI molecular engineer, or you have two molecular engineers, two chatbots chatting with each other. Then they kind of give feedback to each other, and then you have other AI chatbots training on different LLMs that also have different tags in the design and reaching new molecules and new generations. So the idea is, how do we create LLMs that are specific to different tasks and they talk to each other? More specific here, it's maybe this one on solve mechanics problems from the materials point of view, where you have sitting at the table, the chat manager, the admin, the planner, the scientist, the engineer, the executor, the critic. All these are trained for different tasks, and it's not like you are chatting with one, and you as a human are not chatting with them, they are chatting with each other. And they are feeding each other's into the knowledge that they are trained for. The engineer is maybe more training in coding. This one is in fundamental science and things like that. So this one approach, having specific, specialized agents sitting at the table talking to each other. There are other approaches, and this we will see what is best. But another I think is interesting to mention here is the one taken by, in this case, by a company, Lila Science. What they are developing is a super agent, because they believe that rather than having specific agents talking to each other, the intelligence, the super intelligence, coming or benefit from all the knowledge of all the agents in one single element. They rose, I mean, which is something I wanted to also mention, they rose an immense amount of Series A. This is out in the media, which also opens a question that goes beyond the scientific research, but I wanted to put here at the end of the talk, which is there are so much funding into startups nowadays that it starts to be kind of something to keep an eye on as how this evolves over time with such an investment in so many companies. So, and in fact, it's like if you, this is just a quick search of all different startups, and if you go through all this, many of them claim to do something very similar. And as with scientific publications, you start to wonder where there is real advancement or not, and it's very hard to know at the pace at which things are evolving. So just to leave you here with a message that goes a bit beyond of the fundamental research in academia, because I think this revolution is also happening through startups and through real world, let's say, applications in the market. But of course, as with publishing articles, it's overwhelming amount of them, and hard to know where is the real breakthrough advancing. And with that, I'm going to leave it here. I'm going to stop sharing, and I think we still have 15 to 10 minutes, 15 minutes for having some questions. And thank you, everyone who is here right now.
Thank you very much, Fran. That's been a really interesting talk. Definitely plenty of food for thought for all the modelers out there. And yeah, I encourage people to submit questions in the Q&A channel you can see on the top right-hand side of the screen. But yeah, just to warm up the floor, just wanted to basically agree with what you said about good data means good predictions. So this is, I think, is our burden and also our responsibility as scientists to somehow establish with benchmarks and establish how the creation of good data should be, right? Because it's not only with scientific practice, but it's also the danger that people is starting to use AI tools like a black box without knowing what's inside and trusting whatever answer comes from an AI-generated answer, right? Like, so how can we differentiate good answers from bad answers? That's a really, really interesting point and critical point. And yeah, I just wanted to thank you for your highly creative research lines, and not only creative, but also in high demand, because nature-based materials, yeah, are definitely a hot topic right now, and the way AI is aiding in this field is definitely creative, and the potential is, I believe, is huge. So
something, Carla, if I may, before I forget, something I didn't have the time to mention and get into it, but it goes to what you said about black boxes. I think something that is changing now, and there is much more research done in the explainability and transparency in any sort of AI tools. So there is more and more initiatives it's not only in the more general, for instance, agents, or to know where the sources are coming, but in any sort of tool. I mean, I know there are some very good work done on quantum chemistry models and predictions with what we call explainable AI, which is, let's say, have an understanding of how that process is. So try to open that box, that black box, and really understand what's going on there. So, but I totally agree. This is essential.
Yeah, definitely. All right, let's go with the first question from the audience. You mentioned spider webs. So how far are we from creating Spider-Man?
Actually, Spider-Man exists. I'm happy to tell you, in the sense that a spider thread is less than a millimeter thick. While the silk thread of Spider-Man, if you have seen it, it's almost, I would say, more than a centimeter. Meaning, if the spider silk would be as thick as the Spider-Man one is, it would be as strong as it is in the movies. So that means it actually exists, that material is just down in the scale. Now, if you want to same for any other properties of a Spider-Man. If you want to climb the wall, geckos do it. They are just down in the scale. And if you want to have the strand, ants, that's it. So all the superhero properties or abilities you see in a Spider-Man, they already exist. They are some order of magnitude down in the scale. But yeah, maybe we just need to build it up.
Maybe we just need a startup to scale up the product. All right, that was fun. Right, any more questions from the audience? All right, so I believe either people is shy or maybe not having enough time, right? Because we do have nearly 30 people in the call. So I hope everyone enjoyed this talk. And if there are no further questions, let's close the seminar. But yeah, please feel free to get in touch with the speaker or the King's Institute for AI if you are interested in further discussions or collaborations. I believe there's always opportunity for that. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Fran, for this really, really nice talk.
Thank you, Carla, and thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.